Today we'll be reacting to Blackie Speaks. David examining the evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, last I covered this topic, David was a free man. But not too long ago, he got arrested. And I ain't gonna lie, the new evidence came out, yeah, he for sure did it. So he got locked up. Cheer on for that. Yeah, ignore this is sweat rag. So yeah, he got arrested. So last time I speak about it, I said unless he got found guilty or he got arrested, I won't cover the topic again. He got arrested, so we'll cover the topic again. Without further ado, let's get right into it.
Now, ever since David, spelled D4vd, was arrested, people have already made up their minds about what happened. To a lot of people, this case already feels solved, but when you actually slow everything down and examine the evidence prosecutors claim they have against him, you begin to understand why this case has sparked such intense discussion. Over the past few weeks, more and more details have continued coming out, everything from the movement of Tesla, the alleged purchases David made online, and the timeline prosecutors claim they've pieced together. To most people, it already feels like a slam dunk case. However, is that really the case? In this video, I want to take a closer look at the evidence itself, piece by piece, what prosecutors claim it shows, and what certain details may or may not actually prove. On April 16th, 2026, David Burke, known to the world as David, spelled D4vd, was officially arrested and charged with murder in connection to the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. According to prosecutors, David murdered Celeste after she allegedly threatened to expose the so-called relationship between them, something investigators say could have severely damaged both his career and public image. They further allege that after killing her, he dismembered her body and placed the remains in the bags, which were then stored inside the front trunk of his Tesla for months, before eventually being discovered at an impound lot in September 2025. David was taken into custody that same day of April 16, shortly after 4:30 p.m. in Hollywood, and records show he was formally booked into LAPD custody later that evening at around 10:12 p.m. He's currently being held inside Los Angeles County's Twin Towers Correctional Facility, with his next court date scheduled for June 17th, 2026. And unlike a lot of celebrity cases we usually see, David was denied bond almost immediately after his arrest. Now, as David continues sitting inside the county jail awaiting for the next stage of this case, his legal team has reportedly been reviewing the massive amount of evidence prosecutors claim to have against him. And what's interesting is, looking back from the very beginning, David's defense team appeared to be taking a very specific approach here. Like we touched on in previous videos, shortly after his arrest, they were actually pushing for prosecutors to present their evidence as quickly as possible, and they even took it a step further by exercising David's rights to fast-track parts of the legal process, essentially asking the court to quickly determine whether there was enough evidence for this case to move forward to trial, which isn't something you always see in situations this serious. However, that approach would later appear to change, because after prosecutors revealed the new court documents on April 29th, 2026, laying out their theory of what allegedly happened to Celeste, David's defense team would later request a delay in the proceedings. And honestly, considering the extent of the allegations and how much information prosecutors were suddenly laying out publicly, I guess that decision kind of made sense, right? Because by that point, the public was no longer just hearing vague accusations anymore. Now prosecutors were beginning to publicly outline the timeline, the alleged forensic evidence, the purchases, the movements, and the digital trail they believe connects David to what happened. Now,
AKA, they got this shit tougher than we thought. We might be cooked. Hey, you know that Drewski skit? The good news, we got your payment. The bad news is they give you life. Sayonara. Yeah, that's how David's lawyers are moving right now. I ain't gonna lie. They already wrapped this shit up.
Look at the specifics of what prosecutors claim they have against David, piece by piece. Because once you start looking at the case from that perspective, the beginning of the story becomes extremely important. On September 8th, 2025, human remains were discovered inside the front trunk of an impounded Tesla in Los Angeles. But at the same time, investigators had no idea who those remains belonged to. The victim was essentially a Jane Doe. It's a term that essentially describes when a body has not been identified yet. And that matters because at this stage of the investigation, nobody publicly knew where this case was about to take us. Looking back now, the Tesla becomes one of the most important pieces in this entire timeline prosecutors are trying to build. Because according to investigators, almost everything in this case eventually circles back to that vehicle somehow. Now, eventually investigators discover that the Tesla was registered to D4vd, spelled D4vd, but David himself, right? And looking back, this is where the case really starts changing. Because according to the LAPD, the Tesla had already been impounded and sitting at the yard after being towed there by the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. So, meaning for a period of time, the vehicle containing Celeste's remains was allegedly just like, it was just sitting there without anyone publicly understanding the significance of what was inside.
Yeah, they didn't view him as a suspect at first. They just said, okay, he just has some kind of involvement. In fact, I think in between that time, they might have been trying to work up a case against him. I ain't gonna lie.
And honestly, before the Tesla was even connected back to David, the investigators at this point were still dealing with these unidentified remains inside this particular vehicle. But once that connection was eventually made, the entire investigation suddenly starts opening up from there. Looking back through the court filings and timeline prosecutors eventually laid out, this is one aspect of the case I don't think I fully focused on in previous videos, because once the Tesla is connected back to David, you kind of start realizing that investigators weren't just looking at one isolated incident in terms of isolated piece of evidence anymore. At this stage, they were trying to reconstruct movement, communication, timing, and ultimately what prosecutors believe happened behind the scenes leading up to Celeste's death. Now, mind you, at the time, you guys probably know how quiet everything was surrounding this case. We barely knew anything publicly. And honestly, I think a lot of people assumed that investigators were just sitting somewhere not doing shit behind this. Excuse my French. They were not doing really, we thought they weren't really doing anything behind the scenes. But looking back now through these court documents and everything that we found out after.
Yeah, no, they was trying. They took their sweet ass time though. I ain't gonna lie. It took them a minute. But I'd rather them take a minute than get it right than do it too fast and then for them to fuck it all up.
It became a lot clearer of what they were actually building toward. So, salute to them, right? But at this point in the investigation, the focus suddenly shifted. Now investigators are trying to figure out, okay, well, we have the person who owned the car here, we know their name, and so the question now is, who was driving it? Where had it been? Where was it parked previously? And ultimately, how Celeste ended up inside it. And that's why the Tesla itself became such a central part of this entire case. Because from prosecutors' perspective, the vehicle doesn't just contain evidence. It becomes the center of the timeline and the focal point they're now trying to reconstruct. So basically, they're trying to reconstruct everything around this particular vehicle at this point. And then just days later, through dental records, the remains are officially identified as 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And looking back, this is really where the story kind of takes a different direction. Because up until now, these were just unidentified remains found inside an abandoned vehicle. But once Celeste is identified, everything suddenly becomes more personal. Now the focus shifts towards who was this little girl who got obviously brutally murdered in this fashion? How did she become connected to that Tesla? And eventually, how did she really connect to the car owner, David? And once that connection starts getting examined more closely, that's when everything else starts opening up. The reported relationship between them, the prior missing persons report, the messages, the Uber ride to his house, the alleged purchases later traced back to him, the forensic evidence, and ultimately the timeline they now believe led up to Celeste's death. Rest in peace to Celeste. And we take a step back and really look at all those different pieces together. That's when you start understanding why this case eventually became so massive. So now it wasn't an isolated allegation or one isolated piece of evidence. Here the authorities are basically trying to piece together an entire story. And that word right there, honestly, like that word right there, story, is extremely important here, because when you take a closer look at the court documents themselves, you start noticing that the details aren't being presented like random disconnected moments. Everything builds into something else. One detail leads to another, which then connects back to another moment in the timeline. And then suddenly, that's when some of those earlier moments surrounding David start becoming much more significant looking back. Now remember, what makes this entire situation even more significant looking back is that David had already spoken to law enforcement long before Celeste's death, and that part matters a lot. So this wasn't a situation where someone's name randomly appeared after everything happened. There was already documented contact there. Back in February 2024, after Celeste had first been reported missing by her family, authorities had already spoken to him directly. And at the time, he reportedly said he didn't know she was a minor and that he didn't really know where she was because they were looking for her. But looking back now, that conversation becomes a lot more important, because then they realized that this wasn't some random connection discovered after Celeste's death. The relationship between them allegedly goes back well over a year before any of this happened. They just really didn't know it at that point, and they had no clue where the story was heading. And that's what eventually brings the focus right back to the Tesla itself. And this is where taking a closer look at the Tesla becomes really important, because the vehicle, where it was moving, where it was parked, and who was allegedly driving it, eventually becomes one of the central focuses of this entire case. So according to the timeline itself, the Tesla had been sitting on Bluebird Avenue in Los Angeles, just a short walk away from David's Hollywood Hills home. And based on surveillance footage referenced throughout the court documents, David was allegedly the last person seen driving that vehicle on July 29th, 2025, before leaving Los Angeles for a tour. And we really slow down and look at that detail more closely, it starts connecting into everything else prosecutors are trying to establish afterward. Because now the focus isn't just on the Tesla existing anymore. It becomes where was this vehicle, right? When was it moved? Who was around it? And what allegedly happened in the period leading up to it being abandoned. And another thing that stands out here is that they strongly suggest that there was some form of visual documentation connected back to the Tesla, like of David being the last person driving it. Now publicly, we still don't know fully what every piece of footage allegedly shows, whether every single angle clearly identifies David, or how much surveillance footage exists altogether. We just don't know that yet. But what we do know is that the timeline being presented keeps returning to the idea that he was the last known person driving the vehicle before everything that followed. And interestingly enough, the Tesla wasn't parked somewhere deep across the city away from him either. According to the filings, and this is something that came out in April, it was sitting only a short distance from David's own home, literally like a walk away. So the vehicle is essentially just connecting back to the broader timeline being laid out. That's very important to note. Now, another thing worth paying attention to here is that the publicly released documents never explicitly state that the Tesla had been inside his garage before ending up on Bluebird Avenue. However, they do suggest that the vehicle was later moved there shortly before he left for a tour. And we take a closer look at the timing surrounding all this, that's where the sequence of events start becoming especially important. Because according to the timeline being presented, we do know that David's Wither tour officially began on August 5th, 2025, which was just days after prosecutors say he was last seen driving the same Tesla on July 29th. And we take a step back and really look at the sequence right there that's being laid out, you start understanding why the timing surrounding the vehicle keeps getting emphasized so heavily throughout the filings. Now, from their perspective, this isn't just about where did this car exactly end up. It was about reconstructing what they believe was happening in the days leading up to it being abandoned. So from an investigative standpoint, the timeline surrounding the vehicle, the period when the tour or before the tour began, and the movements connected to those final days all start becoming extremely important pieces of the bigger picture. And while we've already lightly touched on parts of this throughout previous videos, perhaps one of the most important aspects of this entire case is when authorities eventually realized that there was allegedly a much deeper connection between David and Celeste than anyone initially understood. And honestly, this part of the story, the public, us, right, we had already pieced all this together before any of these documents were released. Because even before the arrest, there was already a bunch of clips and photos circulating online where you could see that there was some type of relationship there. So they were connected in some type of way, right? That we knew. One clip that surfaced in particular even showed one of David's friends asking him if he was still dating that minor. And then there was also the teacher clip that later surfaced where someone claimed, or I should say a teacher claimed, that they had seen Celeste around David as well.
Celeste Riva's former teacher is saying that Celeste met David on social media. He also says that Celeste ran away from home, then the police picked her up, brought her back, and then she ran away again. He also said that he is the former teacher of one of the kids that were allegedly paid off by David.
How long ago was this?
We all just found out yesterday who it was, but
God damn, that is loud. Fuck, it blew up my eardrums, bro. Damn. Shit.
So when I taught her, she met this dude on social media. He was a rapper in LA. He came and got her. She ran away from home. She was gone for like a month. The cops found her in Hollywood, brought her back to our school. She came back to our school, kind of told people this story. She disappeared again in May of that year, May of 2024. That's when her friends told me what happened, and it was this rapper. And then I found out yesterday that she's now dead in that rapper's car cut into pieces. You want to know how they met? I feel like I just said it. Social media.
At the time, he was kind of describing him as, oh, you know, this rapper guy, whatever. I'm assuming he didn't really know that he was a singer, right? But anyway, so by the time these court filings eventually came out, the idea that there was some type of connection between them wasn't exactly like shocking to a lot of people. We knew it, but the court documents confirmed everything and the extent of it. But what the filings allegedly also revealed was just how deep the connection may have gone. So it was already documented that these two were connected way before Celeste's death. And this is where we start getting into the actual documented history between them. Because when you take a closer look at what authorities say they eventually uncovered, you start realizing that this allegedly went far beyond just random sightings or rumors. And that, of course, includes...
That was crazy. He never got charged for being a minor. Oh, they had shit with CP. CP, which we'll get into, though. They're going to charge him with that, but there's like evidence of he somehow didn't get charged with being a minor. That's crazy to me.
The Riverside County Missing Persons Report, which was filed by Celeste's family. And then we had the February 17th, 2024 interaction between David and law enforcement. Recovered phone records, text messages, and evidence prosecutors say later came from David's devices and iCloud account. And what makes all this especially significant looking back is that almost everything that it was basically pointing to was uncovered after authorities started digging deeper into Celeste's disappearance and eventual death. Because by February 17th, 2024, Celeste was still alive at this point, but she had already been reported missing by her family. And looking back now, this part of the timeline becomes extremely important because these court documents stated that that's when authorities allegedly traced phone records that led directly back to David. And then he gets this call, he picks it up, and he claims he barely knows her, claims he didn't know that she was a minor. And later that same night, officers show up to where he was staying in West Hollywood. They tell him directly, yo, this girl is 13 years old. Also, she ran away. And she has officially been reported missing. Again, at this point, he claimed he didn't know her age and says he had only met her once, but authorities also alleged that during that interaction, David then showed the deputies a yearbook photo of Celeste that was saved on his phone. Now, looking back now, that moment clearly becomes much more significant in the bigger picture prosecutors are trying to present, because according to their timeline, the relationship allegedly continued even after law enforcement had directly informed him that she was a 13-year-old runaway, which means from their perspective, there was already documented awareness there early on. And that later becomes important because it allegedly helps connect a lot of the communication and contact that prosecutors say continued afterward. And this is what the documents say, right? They said that Celeste later returned home, but her parents took her phone away. But prosecutors also allege that David eventually drove out to Lake Elsinore, where Celeste was from, and paid another student around $1,000 to get a new phone to her so they could continue communicating. Well, let's just take a step back and actually think about that allegation. And prosecutors would likely argue that this wasn't a casual situation where these two were in communication. Then they're going to argue that there was a lot of effort behind this, a lot of planning, intentional continuation. And then you start thinking about the phone itself, okay? That phone that he allegedly bought for her. And among the many messages investigators claim to have recovered. And according to prosecutors, things only became more serious from there. They then alleged that the two continued spending time together throughout 2024, weekends at his Hollywood Hills home, trips to Las Vegas, and a bunch of other places. I think London was in this document as well. When you really slow down and take a closer look at this part of the case, you start understanding why prosecutors keep circling back to the relationship itself over and over again, like they did the Tesla. These things are essentially connecting everything, because none of this is being presented like random moments that have nothing to do with each other. The trips, the messages, the phone records, the missing persons report, the alleged arguments, the Uber ride, the timeline. According to the way the filings are laid out, every new detail kind of leads into another detail that was already introduced earlier, almost like one long chain of events, or one bigger story, I should say, where every piece is meant to connect back to something else. And honestly, that's one of the biggest things that stood out to me taking a closer look at all this. Like when I'm kind of going over this again, that's really what stood out. The fact that everything is logically making sense, like the story that they're telling, the prosecution is telling. Like it doesn't feel like prosecutors are just throwing random pieces of evidence at the wall. They're trying to present consistency. I mean, they're eventually going to have to present this shit in court. Excuse my French. They're going to have to present this in court and have all of this make logical sense together to a judge. And from their perspective, there's a logical flow to everything they're laying out, and it makes sense in my head as well. So this timeline they're presenting from the beginning to end is basically meant to prove one continuous sequence of events they believe was happening behind the scenes. And whether people ultimately agree with their conclusion or not, or the judge agrees with their conclusion or not, I guess we'll see, right? But you can absolutely understand why they believe this evidence paints a very specific picture of what they say was happening behind the scenes before Celeste's death. And when you go through the messages investigators say they recovered, you start realizing something else about this case. According to the court documents, this is really important as well. There was one message in particular sent by Celeste to David in March of 2025, just weeks before her death, that prosecutors now appear to view as extremely important. And this is why. In that message, according to investigators, Celeste expressed wanting more from the relationship than what it had become. And looking back at that now, it gives a different perspective on everything prosecutors say happened afterward. Because when all of us heard about this case initially back in September of 2025, and when a lot of these court documents came out, the focus went to the violence, the allegations, the forensic details, and that becoming the center from our perspective, right? But prosecutors seem to be building something much deeper than that. They're trying to establish the emotional state of the relationship itself leading up to April 2025. And according to investigators, even though the two had allegedly broken up by November,
trying to get a motive. That's what they're building up this story, so that way when she does break up with him, oh, there's your motive.
November of 2024, the communication between them never really stopped, which prosecutors now believe is important because, in their view, this wasn't some brief interaction between two people who lost contact, right? And then eventually we get to April 23rd, 2025, the day prosecutors say Celeste arrived at David's Hollywood Hills home and the last day she was ever seen alive. Now, Celeste had no idea that this was going to be her last, day and night alive. Now, up until this point, most people already know the basic outline of the allegations, that Celeste had allegedly threatened to expose the relationship between them. Now, prosecutors believe this became the motive behind her death. So, the night before Celeste disappeared, the two were involved in a lengthy argument over text messages. And investigators claim that the argument centered around David's relationship with other women, and Celeste basically believed that the quote-unquote relationship that they had, right, was not a relationship, but she believed that there was something much more serious between them, and that her and David had potentially a future together. So all this is just extremely disturbing. I don't want to go too deep into that aspect. But basically, the prosecution isn't just presenting cold, hard, forensic evidence. They're presenting an emotion, or multiple emotions: attachment, frustration, jealousy, secrecy. And then as that argument escalated, Celeste eventually threatened to expose the relationship publicly in a way prosecutors say could have damaged David's career and public image. Now, obviously, Celeste is no longer here to explain her side of any of this herself, right? Rest in peace to the little girl. So what prosecutors seem to be doing instead is using the communication between them to reconstruct what they believe her emotional state may have been during those final weeks and days of her life. And that's very important because, according to investigators, the messages allegedly recovered don't just show communication between two people. It's basically showing and becoming the connective tissue tying the entire timeline together. And the investigators placed a huge amount of importance on the timeline surrounding her arrival at David's home, because it was around 8:40 p.m. that David arranged for an Uber to pick Celeste up from Lake Elsinore, where her family home was located. And then the communication between them continued before and throughout the ride itself, and then at approximately 10 past 10 p.m., that's when Celeste arrived at the Hollywood Hills home where David was staying, right? And this is where the timeline starts becoming extremely important, because according to prosecutors, just around 20 minutes later, at approximately 10:30 p.m., David allegedly begins sending messages asking where Celeste was. And prosecutors now believe those messages are one of the most significant details in the case, because according to their theory, and I feel like we didn't go deep enough on this, but those texts were not genuine attempts to locate where she was at, because he was like messaging her like, hey, where you at? But instead, the prosecution alleged that this was a part of an effort to create the appearance that Celeste had never actually arrived at the house in the first place. And this is kind of what makes you realize why the prosecution appears so focused on timestamps and the communication records and the ride data and digital activity throughout that night. Because by the time
I had to stand up, y'all. I was getting too tired. I was just focusing, bro. I haven't really focused throughout the whole video. I ain't gonna lie.
messages were sent, they said that Celeste was already dead at this point, right? And then when she had eventually arrived, David stabbed her multiple times is what they said. And then the timing becomes very impossible to ignore. This is a very big part about this aspect, because just 2 days later, David was preparing to release his debut album. His career was of course growing rapidly, major opportunities were opening up. And according to prosecutors, that pressure and timing is a major part of the motive they now believe existed in this case. This part is so big So we really slow down and take a look at everything they are presenting, particularly for this aspect right here. That's probably the part of the case that hits the hardest, because behind all the headlines, right, and just the brutality of this particular case, you start realizing that this was still a 14-year-old girl. Like, Celeste was a child, right? A girl who, according to investigators, seemed emotionally attached to somebody much older than her. Somebody with fame, somebody with money, somebody with status, who had a very poppin' and growing career, who was literally about to travel the world just in a few months, right? And when you look at the messages they say that they recovered, especially the ones where Celeste allegedly wanted something deeper from the relationship, it paints a very sad picture looking back. Because regardless of what people believe, I just really want you to think about what Celeste might have been feeling in that particular moment, what she was going through, right? And the picture you get is that she was just far more emotionally invested in the situation working out than David himself. Obviously, I don't want to get too detailed about what I think she might have been going through, because I just don't know, right? But I just think this part is kind of important that we just sit with. You get what I'm saying? But that's what makes this part of the case feel so like dark emotionally. While David was preparing for an album rollout, interviews, a tour, and the biggest moment of his career, there was allegedly a 14-year-old
14-year-old girl in the back of a Tesla just caught body.
Girl behind the scenes becoming more emotionally attached, more frustrated, and eventually more desperate to be acknowledged. And prosecutors now believe that the emotional tension is what everything else in this case eventually spiraled out of, right? And I guess that's where taking a closer look at the evidence becomes important, because if you really step back and think about how somebody would defend against all this shit, excuse my French, you start realizing why prosecutors structure the case the way they did. Because it's not just one thing here. They apparently have phone records, they have messages, they have travel.
They have like over 40,000 gigabytes of CP, bro. And by the way, 1 gigabyte is like, or 10, I forgot what it was, but low number of gigabytes is like over 1,000 vids. I think it was 100 gigabytes is like 1,000. Is 1,000 videos, bro. Fucking sick, bro.
They have a
Fuck
timeline.
David.
They have alleged purchases. They have surveillance footage. And then the context surrounding all of it. Now, of course, defense attorneys are very creative people. And I'm sure eventually there will be arguments made about things like this being misinterpreted, or that some of these details don't necessarily prove murder by themselves, even though they have all this other shit too, right?
See, that's why you charge him with the freaking pedophilia shit, bro. Because if in case they pulled that bullshit, at least the pedophilia one, you can't deny. They probably sitting there right now saying, "Hey, thank God there's no pedophilia charges." Because otherwise, we would have been cooked.
For example, somebody could theoretically, I guess, argue that David and Celeste were simply close, that he was just somebody in her life, or that certain interactions are being framed in the worst way after the fact. But then again, prosecutors would eventually or immediately point to the age difference, the nature of the messages, the explicit photographs investigators claim they recovered, and the overall progression of the relationship they say they uncovered. And honestly, one of the more disturbing things about when you just think about all this is the amount of alleged planning and coordination involved in all this. All this just seems so deep. Prosecution wasn't just claiming one isolated interaction. I mean, we're talking about trips to Las Vegas, London, Texas to meet his family. And if you know how artists at that level usually travel, especially once touring and major label schedules get involved, there are often multiple people around these artists at all times. Managers, teams, assistants.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. If you look at other things, he did not do it by himself, bro. Someone else had to help him out. God damn, I'm not used to this ring. My God damn. Yeah. Oh, I see outline of it. I'm not used to the ring light yet, bro. God damn.
Booking schedules, flights being arranged, which makes all this that the prosecution is describing feel even more significant looking back. And another thing prosecutors would likely point to is the way David allegedly spoke to investigators back in February 2024. Because at that point, he was already trying to create some type of distance between himself and Celeste at that point. So he basically he was claiming like, I don't really know, what are you talking about? This runaway, this minor, I don't really know this girl. And he claimed that he didn't know where she was, but according to investigators during that same interaction, deputies also saw that yearbook photo of Celeste saved on his phone. And looking back now, prosecutors would likely argue that, that particular interaction becomes important because it allegedly shows David trying to minimize the relationship long before Celeste's death ever happened. And then later, prosecutors say investigators discovered even more details through the autopsy itself. Because according to the autopsy report, and I made an entire video on this, but 2 of Celeste's fingers, including the finger that allegedly contained...
There's a finger on there that says shush. David has that finger too. That dude is guilty. Lock him up. Lock him up. In a robot voice.
A tattoo of David's name had been amputated and were never recovered. And prosecutors now allege that this may have been an attempt to further distance Celeste from him. Now, obviously, all this will eventually have to be argued in court, right? But we take a closer look at the evidence prosecutors are presenting, especially for this part as well, you can start understanding why they believe all of these details connect together into one larger story. Now, one of the things I've personally been wondering about while looking through all this is the tattoo itself. Because according to prosecutors, one of the fingers that was allegedly removed contained this tattoo of David's name. And when you really think about that detail, just think about that for a second. That opens up an entirely different set of questions. Because if they're claiming that these two were allegedly spending all this time together, traveling, staying at his house, flying to all these different places, meeting family members, then naturally you start wondering, when exactly did she get that tattoo? Because let's just think about this logically for a second. If investigators are able to determine roughly when she got it, then theoretically they could also potentially figure out where she got it, who may have been with her at the time. There's probably surveillance there or in the area. There's probably payment records, messages discussing it. If there's not actual payment records, was this perhaps paid by cash by another person? If that was the case, what does that show? Or even witnesses who saw them together around that period. And that's kind of what makes this entire case feel so layered from an investigative standpoint, because every new detail prosecutors introduce has the potential to connect back to another part of the timeline, whether that's the relationship, the traveling, the communication, the alleged secrecy surrounding everything. And then there's another very disturbing aspect to all this, right? Which is investigators claim they also recovered explicit photographs, which they say confirm the relationship had become sexual, right? And you really stop and think about that for a second, makes the entire emotional dynamic prosecutors are describing even way more dark. They also really focused on the immediate attempt to cover all this up. This is when they documented that David drove to Santa Barbara County in an effort to dispose of her belongings and destroy evidence. And again, this is another example of prosecutors trying to build one continuous timeline where every action connects directly into the next action. Now, the thing that strikes me here is how much of this case prosecutors appear to be building around behavior and timing. Because if their timeline is accurate, then according to the prosecutors, within minutes of Celeste arriving at the house, the situation had already completely shifted. I mean, imagine how blindsided she must have been in that moment, man. Like, damn. And that's why the communication aspect of these last interactions are such a key focus. Because their argument is, while one reality was allegedly taking place inside the house, another reality was simultaneously being created digitally through texts, calls, timestamps, and movement. So the communication after her arrival wasn't random. The driving afterward wasn't random. The movements of the Tesla weren't random. Each action was connected to the next one in a very deliberate way. Now, obviously, we as the public, we still haven't seen every single piece of evidence investigators claim to have recovered. We haven't seen the full phone extractions or anything like that, or the complete digital records, or every piece of surveillance prosecutors say that they have. So at this point, a lot of it is still just the prosecution laying out their version of events. But even with that said, when you really slow down and look at the timeline they're presenting, it's hard to not understand why this case has gotten to the point where it has. I mean, the deviousness of what they say happened here is crazy. So let's talk about some of the alleged purchases that David made during this time. Just one day after, they say that David ordered a shovel from Home Depot, which was then delivered directly to his house through Postmates. And then on May 1st, he ordered 2 different chainsaws from Amazon. And then just a few days after that, they claimed that additional items were ordered: a body bag, heavy-duty laundry bags, and a blue inflatable pool, all allegedly directly delivered to his house. Now, when it comes to...
God damn it, can you work?
to these particular purchases right here, this was also a very big part of the documents, right? And according to their theory, none of the actions here or before existed in or happened in isolation. We're talking the timing of the purchase, the alleged movements afterward, the trip to Santa Barbara County. Like, all this is just, it's one continuous, consistent story that all connects back into one larger timeline. And also the fact that they claim that these purchases were made under a fake name, and the name was Victoria Mendez. From an investigative standpoint, that obviously became another detail prosecutors appeared to believe point toward concealment and intent. Those are two very important words here. And then literally just 3 days after those purchases were made, they said that David then returned to the same Santa Barbara County area he had previously traveled to after Celeste's death. And then here they said that he left his home around 11:30 p.m. on May 8th. And then according to prosecutors, he allegedly returned to that same area yet again on May 31st, 2025. And honestly, looking back at all this now, like especially these details right here and everything that we talked about before, the structure of this entire case just makes way too much sense. We're talking a sequence of actions unfolding over time, which is also why this part of the evidence has probably become one of the most heavily discussed aspects of this entire case online. Because when you hear chainsaws, body bags, inflatable pools, late night drives, fake names, repeated returns to the same location, it stops feeling like an isolated allegation to a lot of people. And notice how every piece of this entire story that the prosecution is telling all connects back to the next thing. It's almost like every piece is meant to support the next piece that follows afterward. And I think moving forward, one of the biggest things to watch in this case is probably going to be the witnesses themselves. Because at the end of the day, the court is different from internet speculation, right? Eventually people are going to have to testify. People around David, people who allegedly saw certain things. What did these people see? We already know that the young man Neo appears to play some type of role in these, or in the witness situation. David's parents were also reportedly subpoenaed as well, but we still don't fully know the extent of what certain witnesses may or may have not, or may not actually say once this case reaches trial eventually, or if it gets to that point. And honestly, I think that's when we'll really start seeing which parts of this timeline prosecutors are most confident in proving. I guess we'll see how all of this plays out. But yeah, if you made it this far, drop a like on this video and subscribe if you're new here. My name is
Hey, WV Black C, WV, bro, I'm tired, so, bro, I gotta do one more and then wrap this shit up. So hope y'all enjoyed that video. Got nothing else to say. I'll see y'all later. Peace.